and we'll go ahead and get started. In this session, we're going to spend about an hour talking about MIST 4.0. We're just going to be able to do a brief overview of the release as it is quite large. We'll probably cover about half to three-quarters of the main features and really only a thin slice of some of the smaller enhancements. This is the largest release of MIST ever. I think probably the most important release of MIST ever, and hopefully you'll agree when you see some of the new functionality that we built in. And it's really kicking off the beginning of a big 2015 for us, which is also going to include a substantial number of additional releases, both related to Biml, related to our other product Vivid, which is an add-in for Excel, and I think you'll also be seeing quite a number of new online things coming online, both from a training and a use perspective, and also some new functionality specifically related to Biml and some of the things that we're going to be able to do with that online. So I think 2015 is going to be an exciting year, and let's, for the next hour, focus on what we've already shipped, which is MIST 4.0. This shipped about 3 to 4 weeks ago, and we do have a maintenance release for this that is going to be coming out this week. With any release of this size, you're going to have some number of usually smaller issues, and we've taken those reports from customers who have already been using it, and the maintenance release will address all of those in the coming week. So just a quick overview of some of the things that we're going to cover here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on each of these because we just won't have the time to go into great depth on all of them, but we're going to spend most of our time in MIST itself. So this slide deck is really just a placeholder so I can introduce the features, and then we'll jump over to MIST and take a look at them in action. So we're going to look at kind of general UI enhancements, the new connection designer feature, which I know a lot of people have been looking forward to, a huge overhaul to the logical view, build and workflow enhancements, improvements to both SSIS and SSAS in terms of both language features and some of our emission capabilities, and then a lot of improvements to code. Language features in Biml script, API features that make it easier to write your code nuggets, and a code editing experience vastly improved. And then finally, we're going to talk about the metadata features, both the offline schema metadata and the new metadata modeling functionality that makes it a lot easier to build your own metadata repositories on top of a common abstraction methodology. And finally, we'll go over some of the breaking changes. There really only are a handful of those, and if you're not using analysis services, it's probably not going to take you more than about 5 minutes to address. So let's jump right in. Oh, quick note, for those of you who are interested in Bits Helper and how many of these features are appearing in Bits Helper, anything that's also in Bits Helper is highlighted in red. There will be a few things, a lot of the Bits Helper enhancements, or a lot of the enhancements that apply to Bits Helper are some of the more tactical things. So you're not going to see a lot of red on here as it focuses more on the MIST functionality, but we did take care to call out those things that will apply to the Bits Helper users as well as we go throughout the presentation. So, general UI. First big thing, and I know this has been something that the community has been asking for some time, is true multiple document interface. So in previous versions of MIST, you could have multiple documents and that you could have a code editor and a visual designer, but it could only be for one asset at a time. If I had one table open and switched to another, the old table would switch away. Now we had forward and back navigation that made that a little easier to use, but now we have true multiple document interface. So you can have as many windows open as you have memory in your system, essentially, or until you start slowing down because you're paging into your hard disk. In order to make this work, we did a huge amount of memory tuning in particular, since MIST is a WPF application, and WPF, which is Microsoft's Windows presentation framework, tends to be a bit on the memory hungry side. We did a bunch of tuning to make sure that you would still have a great experience and you wouldn't see those ballooning memory numbers when you checked in your task manager at your MIST executable, your process. We also changed the MIST theme. It's now has a more modern look and feel. It's in general lighter in color. We've added a notifications window, done reorganization all throughout, improved our dialogues, and a minor thing, but something that I think is very useful, our jump list in Windows 7 Plus. When you right-click on a docked icon there for MIST, our jump list now exactly matches the items that you have in your MIST window, pinned items and everything. So let's just take a quick look at this. Here's the new MIST 4.0, already launched, and I'm going to go ahead and open up just a sample project here. And what you'll see is a ribbon that is largely reorganized. So now we've grouped things under relational, integration services, analysis services, and metadata store. And we'll see in the next slide here with logical view, We've done the same thing in the logical view. And if I decide to start opening up, let's say a couple of packages, and these are duplicates that we'll see as part of a later demonstration, I've now got them all open. I can put them side by side. I can tile them however I want to. I can even take these windows and put them on separate displays. I can also go and view the Biml script designer for this one and the Biml window for this one. There we go. So we have that true MDI experience, which for most people I think makes things a lot easier. And with this number of windows we have open, let's see, it's a total of about 6. There's nothing really complex going on here, but if I were to go ahead and take a look at our process here, actually this is VS Host as the process here, it's 258 megs. I'll just drop to 254. So we did a lot in terms of tuning the memory on this to make sure that not only was the performance really nice on initial load, but also you could open up a lot of assets and still have a great experience there without having to worry about things starting to slow down or grind to a halt rather. On the notifications window, there's nothing in here right now. We'll see some notifications later. But this is similar to the functionality that you'll find in Visual Studio. If there's any notifications related to your license or related to offline schemas, related to new versions, you'll see this flag turns red. You'll see a number for the count of notifications that are there, and then you'll see your list of notifications that you can individually dismiss or deal with as you see fit. And perhaps just a crowd-pleasing feature that I'll note here. If I go ahead and add in a couple of items, let's say I add in 3 items, and I do, this is part of the dialog box enhancement. We had multi-select delete in the past, but it had multiple dialog boxes that would pop up. That's all fixed now. So whenever it makes sense to have just one dialog, you get just one dialog. All dialogs are now updated for the modern style. So there we go. All 3 are gone. Let me go ahead and close all these windows because we're going to use this for the next part of the demonstration as well. So next up we have connection designers. One of the problems in previous versions of MIST is that we basically relied on the developer to know connection string syntax, and if most developers are like me, it's something you're constantly having to go and refer to a reference manual around because every provider has potentially different key value pairs, and furthermore they're just difficult to remember. So now if we go ahead and add in a new connection, let's say a OLEDB connection, right at the top. We now get a connection designer that allows us to visually construct our string. This isn't the connection designer we had in MIST 3.4, which was based on the standard control that Microsoft had open sourced. There were a variety of issues with that control. What we've done is built something from the ground up that we think works as well or better than any connection designer we've dealt with in the past. So for OLEDB, we start by selecting our provider. Here's a list of installed providers on the system, and I can go ahead and pick, let's say, SQL Native Client 11. Once we pick that provider, we get a set of options that's specific to that provider. So I can say, for example, I'd like to connect to localhost, and you'll see as I'm typing, it's constructing my connection string up here. And if I want to make edits to my connection string, I can do that, and you'll see it's reflected in the designer at the same time. So now I can also say I'd like to use Windows Authentication, but I don't have any databases. If I click Update, that was probably faster than you could even see, but we get our full list of databases. By the way, unlike most connection string designers we've worked with in the past, this UI will never block. So if you happen to have a bad server and you try and connect to it and you hit Update, you're still going to be able to interact with your UI, and you can actually go ahead and cancel that request. In fact, let me go ahead and demonstrate that. Localhost 1.2, I'm going to go ahead and hit Update. I can still go ahead and interact with my UI. There's nothing stopping me from doing that, and I can go ahead and hit Cancel, and then I can go ahead and actually go back to my correct one and grab, let's say, AdventureWorks 2008. And now I'm ready to move forward. Oops, there we go. Connection succeeded. Now if I go through and grab our, let's say, a file connection, as you can see, we've got custom connections for everything, for every different connection type. So I can do all the things that you would expect in a file connection. I can do all the things that you would expect in, let's say, ODBC. So here, if I open up ODBC, I can select my DSN, and it's actually inspecting my installed DSNs. If I were to select, let's just do one more, let's say Oracle. We get an Oracle-specific designer where now I can go ahead and provide a TNS service name and other information as necessary. So we think that's a huge improvement over what we had in MIST in the past, and I think in some ways actually leapfrogs what's available in other tools as well. Our hope is in this release and in subsequent releases as we make this even better, MIST is the go-to tool if you need to design connection strings so that you never have to worry about that syntax again. Okay, let's jump back over. So that's the connection designers. Next up, let's talk about logical view enhancements. Now, we've already seen a handful of the features here just because we brought up the UI and they're kind of hard to miss. For example, the top-level groups for better organization that match the ribbon reorganization. We've added some other things as well. So we've got the default open action. So when you double-click on an item or when you hit enter, what does it do? Does it bring up the designer? Does it bring up the Biml editor? Does it bring up the Biml designer? We actually allow you to configure that now, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. We also permit custom grouping under each of the root nodes. So there's a field called logical display folder that will actually create a folder system underneath. We've had a lot of requests from folks about reorganizing the logical view in various ways. Unfortunately, all of those requests, or not all of them, but almost all of them, are mutually exclusive and incompatible, where some people would say, I'd like you to group, let's take tables for example, by schema first and then by table. And others would say, I'd like you to group by table name first but then have the schema sorting underneath. And other people would ask for other things entirely. This is someplace where we're going to continue to make improvements, but for the time being, the logical display folder provides us a lot of options around customizing our view, and I'll show you how to use that in just a second. We also have an enhanced library node down here. Transformers, frameworks, build configurations, these are some of the most powerful features of MIST, but the discoverability of those features in past releases was admittedly quite bad. So what we've done now is we've taken our library and we've broken it out by each of these different types and made it much more discoverable and made it much easier to use, and we'll see how that lines up in just a second. We've also added support for broken live Biml scripts, and this is going to be best if I show you with an example in just a moment. And we've also added support for other file types. So you can actually have .NET code files in your solution now, and you can also have some miscellaneous files like SQL scripts, MDX, DAX, text files, etc. And we've also added an add new item dialog, which we'll see in just a moment. So let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at that. Here we are back in MIST. Now, let's say I wanted to add in a few tables. So I'm going to add in, let's say, table 1, table 2, table 3, table 4, and table 5. And the first thing I'd like to do is customize, and notice these open by default when I create them, which is the behavior most people would like. I'm going to go ahead and close all those out. First thing I'm going to do is customize what happens when I double-click. So when you first install MIST, when you double-click on an item or when you hit enter, you get the visual designer. But some people really just love to spend all their time in Biml. So what I can do is double-click on my project and go into the settings here, and we have a default action when opening item. Presently, it's set to visual designer only. If I click on this, I actually get a large number of options. I can switch to Biml editor only. I can switch to Biml designer only. Or I can switch to these pairs like Biml editor and visual designer, but make the visual designer the active window. Right, so I get both of them, but which one's actually going to be focused and activated once the open operation is complete. So if I were to change it from visual designer to, let's say, Biml editor and just save, now when I double-click table, I get the Biml editor. If I were to switch it to Biml designer, some folks aren't familiar with the distinction between the Biml editor and the Biml designer. Here's the Biml editor. If I double-click on table 2, here's the Biml designer. This is the one that shows you the preview window if you happen to have script in that file. And then if I switch it to something like editor and visual designer with visual designer active, and I double-click on table 3, we'll notice that we get 2 new windows. There's my Biml, there's my visual designer, and the visual designer was active. So I'm going to go ahead and switch this back just for the remainder of the demo to visual designer only. And I think for a lot of people, this is upgrade worthy just right here, you know, in terms of not having to do the right click and view Biml every time you want to see the code. Let me go ahead and close all those windows. And now we're going to take a look at the logical display folder grouping. So if I click here on table 1, and let's say I'd really like to have table 1, table 2, and table 3. Let's say maybe they're all in the same schema, and table 4 and 5 are in a different schema, or they're different types of tables. If I'm doing data vault, perhaps some of those are hubs, and some of those are links, and some of those are satellites. And I'd like to be able to categorize those to make them easier to find and to manage. Well, we now have this property under each of our root level items called logical display folder, and I can type in here group 1. And group 1, you'll notice that table 1 just went into group 1. Right? And if I go ahead and take, let's say, table 2 and table 3, and I put those in the same logical display folder, they're now all grouped together. And then I can take table 4 and table 5 and say I'm going to put those in logical display folder group 1, but actually what I'm going to do is put those in group 2 instead. Now I have, well, I just did group. So group in group 1. And now if I wanted to, let's say, have a subpath, let's say I've got a lot of tables and I want to have a pretty deep ordering to those tables. So I can just say group 1 and I can put a slash or a backslash and I can say subgroup. Right? So you can put this as deep as you want it to go. Now the best part about all of this, because you know as well as I do that if you're doing a lot of Biml code, a lot of these assets are going to be auto-generated, and you don't want to have to do this every single time you regenerate assets or you make a change. Well, that's the best part about it. This is actually a property on the Biml. So if I were to go ahead and put in a code nugget here, and let me just turn it into a string just so you can see that this works, we'll notice it doesn't move. It becomes a, where's my table 1? Oh, it would help if I had my end quote there. That's actually invalid Biml. This is actually a great demonstration of something here. Actually, we'll do that in just a moment. So there we go. And there it is. So now I have group 1, subgroup 1, and then there's table 1. Right? And you'll see that it has a little Biml wheel, which means it was code generated. So you can very easily, if you know you're loading from certain schemas or loading into certain types of subject areas, you can easily just set this logical display folder item right there. Now it doesn't exist in a property on the object, but you can do the same thing with files. And this is actually stored in the project file when you do it here. So I can actually put build settings here in its own display folder and put as many of those in there as I want. So you can do that in your library also, even though the mechanism is slightly different. The next thing I want to talk about is broken live Biml scripts. So here's a problem that we've all run into. Right? So we've got this Biml script here, and then we do something that in one of our code nuggets breaks something. Let's say I do a null.toString. Right? I'm dereferencing this null, and that's illegal. And that means that when I try and run this, when the background process tries to compile this file, it's going to produce an error, and it's not going to be able to produce any Biml assets. So what happens is, depending on exactly the state I'm in, if it was previously okay and then it's good, I actually have these orphaned objects sitting around that actually aren't correct anymore, and my Biml file isn't actually producing the assets. Or if I were to close the project and reopen it, I wouldn't see any of those things because the script wouldn't be compiling at all. And I kind of have to go into my project view and find the offending file, and it's just cumbersome. But what we've done now is added this new broken live Biml script feature. So if I allow this to recompile, we're going to see two things happen. One, you'll see that, hey, look, we're not going to throw away this table because it might be useful for you to look at and compare against your script, but we're going to tell you that this is broken right now by putting this Biml wheel with the slash mark through it. So this is not a real asset anymore. This is something that is just left over from the last time this table1.biml script file successfully compiled. And if you want to go ahead and fix that issue, you can rest assured that down here in Broken Live Biml Scripts, you will have the list of all the files that contain any live Biml script errors. And if I now remove the offending line of code, we'll see that that disappears, and my table goes back to normal. So just a feature that's useful so that it's less confusing as people are writing large amounts of code and they introduce that one little bug that forces the compiler to fail under the covers. Support for other file types is the next major feature. So if we go and look at the file types here, we have .NET code capabilities, so we can create C# files and VB files, and we'll see how we can use those in a very interesting way a bit later on. And we can also add other types of miscellaneous files. So if I add a SQL file here, for example, and now we also get a view of our Add New Item dialog, we can add different types of files, we can add different types of objects. Here are all my connections, for example. So if you add an item now from Project View, or if you do a right-click and add item here in the library in logical view, you get your new Add New Item dialog box. And I'm going to go ahead and grab this SQL file and hit Add. And now we get a script.sql, and you'll notice it may be a bit hard to see, so I'll zoom in. And this is something I didn't mention in general UI. Zoom now works everywhere in Mist. Wherever you currently have focus, you go ahead and you can zoom in and out by holding Control and mouse wheeling, or you can use this little slider down here at the bottom. Or if you do a Control and do a center click, it'll set it back to 100%. Or if you do Control 0, just like in your browser, it'll put it back to 100%. So all those sort of keyboard and mouse shortcuts work the way you would expect them to. And that works in any window. You notice I just did it in logical view. Here it is in property view. Let me go ahead and do in property view. And even, and I'm sure this is going to be welcome to a lot of folks, here it is in package designer. I can zoom in, I can zoom out. Great. So back to the other file types. Here we have script1.sql. In future versions, this is going to be enhanced so that you can actually run these queries and get an interface that's more like SSMS for your query authoring. But for now, at least you get code colorizing and you can visualize these scripts, especially if they're being used as external files that you're referencing from your Biml scripts. You can go ahead and have those as part of your logical view. And as I said before, you can also put in text files, you can also put in MDX stacks, and you can even put in other file types as you want to, if you want to, and they'll all go ahead and show up in miscellaneous. But those are the ones that you can author in here, which is the reason why they're in the drop-down list. Add new item dialog, just as one more note on that, is fully extensible. So we have a configuration file that you can change that will change what these items look like. So you can take our items and you can enhance them. So let's say you want it to have, for your organization, a special pattern that is the starting template that you use for all of your new packages. You could go ahead and actually modify this so you would have a templates folder right here and have all your templates in there. And then people, when they went ahead and did it, just like if I go ahead and add in a, let's say, analysis services connection and hit add, we'll see it went ahead and added analysis. I did it in the library, which is why it showed up here. But you can see it went ahead and was pre-filled out. We can do the same. You can do the same thing with your own templates. Basically, you create little Biml scripts that execute and take as parameters the file location and everything else, so that you can go ahead and fill those templates out with your customized settings. Okay, so that's the add new item dialog and the logical view enhancements. Let's take a look at the build and workflow enhancements. And this has got another, I think, a couple of real crowd-pleasing features. We have added the ability, finally, to suspend live Biml scripts and to refresh all Biml scripts with a single click of a button, which you'll see down here at the bottom. We also have added the ability to much more easily use framework files without having to set a build parameter inside of your project settings. And we also have timeout support for database queries used during build. So this is a parameter that you can set. Previously, it would basically run forever if we were trying to connect to a database while doing your SSIS builds to get data flow, the external column metadata for data flows. Now you can actually set that timeout globally if you like. So you don't have to worry about for servers that are are potentially down or potentially slow. You won't have to worry about our default settings working for your environment. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at those, and these are pretty straightforward. So one of the things that comes up a fair bit with folks is they'll say, hey, I have this large number of dependent files where scripts are doing all kinds of things. They're talking to databases, and it takes a long time to run. And then I just have like a couple of environment files in the front end, which are all in flat Biml code, and I hate when I edit those flat Biml files that I have to wait for all of those downstream things to recompile, as I'm typing essentially. What you can do in situations like that where you have a lot of changes to make is you can go ahead and hit suspend live Biml scripts. And what happens now is any changes you're going to make, let me go ahead and actually do this. So we have a Biml script in here, but you'll notice that when I go into this view Biml and start changing this other Biml file and I hit save, there's no background processing happening. And when I hit enable live Biml scripts again, which I can either do from up here or by right-clicking down here, there we go, it goes ahead and updates. We also have the ability to do refresh all. So let's say you've got an external metadata source that's driving a lot of these, the downstream processing. Instead of having to go and find a file in tier 0 and hit spacebar and then hit save, you can now actually just hit the refresh all button. Or if there's a specific file that you want to refresh, you can actually go ahead and right-click, and you'll find that there is a refresh option now in the context menu, which you can do either in the logical view or in the project view on a file-by-file basis, and that refresh is smart. So if I refresh something in tier 1, it will also refresh the dependencies downstream from tier 1. So it'll refresh only what it needs to in order for you to have the right thing happen when you refresh a particular asset. One more thing is around framework selection. So previously, frameworks were kind of hidden. They were in the library under miscellaneous files. Now you can actually add in frameworks. right here. They go into the framework folder. I'm going to go ahead and add 2 of them. We don't have a visual designer for these yet, and we probably will in future releases, but these are very simple, straightforward files. If you have a framework where you're running a whole bunch of transformers as part of your build process, we even have some code that shows you. We even have a little comment in there that shows you basically how to do it. So you can specify as many frameworks as you like. They're all going to sit here in your frameworks folder. Now when I'm up in my build and deploy ribbon, you'll see as long as I have project view selected, I can actually select the framework that I want to use for my build right here. So no selection means don't use any frameworks. If I go ahead and hit framework 1, I'm going to use framework 1, and then when I press build, it's going to apply that framework. So very quick sort of switching between the different frameworks that I might want to use. Furthermore, if I'm using build configurations now have Biml framework selections right here as well. So remember, a build configuration is going to override what you're building out of the project view. So I can select a build, this build configuration. I can select that this is the framework it should use, and then when I select that, I don't get to override the framework. That wouldn't make sense in context of a Biml proj file, but I can make that selection here. So we have now much better surfacing of our frameworks and a much easier ability to go ahead and use them. So let's go ahead and jump into SSIS enhancements. There's going to be less to show here in terms of demos, so we may just focus mostly on slides for time purposes. Here's where we start to see some red. So remember, that means this is also supported in BITS Helper. So we have 2014 support. We now have full support for all the encryption options. I know for some of you who have maybe spoken to me about this in the past, I have been very resistant to adding the encryption options. So encrypt all with password, encrypt all with user key, encrypt sensitive with password, encrypt sensitive with user key. And the reason for that is my philosophy was always that you shouldn't be storing your sensitive information in your Biml files. You shouldn't be. You should always be using package configurations or project environments in order to be using that information, or you should be dynamically querying it from some secure source. That is something by popular demand, and also for a few technical reasons we really did need to have this in here, so it is now in there. If you set your encryption settings, you're going to get the behavior that you expect, and it's going to be output exactly as if BITS had done the encryption for you. So we're fully compatible. If you do a password encryption in MIST and you open it up in BITS, it'll ask you for the password. Or if you use user key, it'll just open up, presuming that you are doing it from the same user account where you did your build. If you're doing it from a different user account, of course it won't open, which is the exact same scenario that you would have with BITS authorship. We've also added SSIS path annotations. This is a feature that not everybody is familiar with. This is essentially one of those things which is a visualization feature in SSIS, where it determines whether or not a little label will show up next to your paths in your control flow and your data flow. So this isn't the full-blown annotation feature. We don't have that yet, mostly because annotations have to have an XY coordinate system in order to actually function correctly. But we have the ability now to say, do actually show the labels. And I'm opening up Visual Studio on the other display here to actually show you what this looks like. But Visual Studio is being a little slow opening, so we'll just move on and we can talk to it a bit more later if folks are curious about that. We also now do IcePack emission. So if you do a build and you're targeting 2012 or 2014 and you've selected project deployment mode, we will output an IcePack folder in the bin subdirectory of your target path, just like Visual Studio would if you did a build from inside there. This is something that people had worked around in the past, where they would do their auto-generation out of MIST, and then they would have a devenv/build or /rebuild command they would do as a subsequent automation step in order to create their IcePack file for then, in most cases, automated deployment of that IcePack file. Now we've taken that extra step out of the picture. We'll do the IcePack file emission for you directly without you having to use that extra Visual Studio step. We've also made tons of enhancements to the package importer. So if you check out the package importer, we now have a new dialog box here that allows you to choose importing a DT-proj file, importing an IcePack file, importing a collection of DTSX files, or importing a project from a package catalog. In fact, I can go ahead and point this at localhost and connect, and then I can see my SSIS DB, and here's just a very simple one that was in there, and if I hit import, what it does is it shows me everything that is about to add to my project if I choose to, and then I can go ahead and add to project and it'll push it in. So if I add to project, now I have my new package and my package project. So here's my package project, and here is my new package, and this was, I believe, just an empty package. So that is all now added in, and perhaps the best part is that you can call the importer programmatically. So in your Biml code, there is an importer class and an import options class and an import results class. So we don't have time to show that scenario just now, but you can, just like you do with import DB or get database schema, you can do that with packages now as well, and you can go ahead and get those. You'll get an import results object back that has all of the imported packages, all the script projects, all the connections, all the file formats, and any of the other objects that were imported as part of that process, and then you can call get Biml on them, you can do transformations to them, whatever you need to do. We've also added a variety of tasks and components, 10 in total, so specifically focusing on CDC, which is entirely there, and also in Bits Helper, DQS, the cleansing component, and the connection that goes with it. And then not in Bits Helper, because our policy presently on task versus components and deciding what's in and what's out in Bits Helper is if it ships in the box with SSIS, you do a clean install of SSIS. If it shows up in your toolbox, then it's in Bits Helper. If it doesn't show up in your toolbox, then it's something that might be missed only. So here we have PDW is now fully supported, the connection and destination component in MIST, and so are the Teradata to complement the the Oracle Attunity component support that we already have. Just as a quick note, you can still do these with custom components in Bits Helper if you choose, but they really are much easier to work with in MIST. You've got the tags that are exactly what you would expect them to be, and you have the ability. Let me just actually go ahead and open that up and show you what that looks like. So if I drop in a data flow, for example, and then put in a SQL Server PDW destination. Just type in PDW. There we go. I get my visual designer for it where I can add stuff in, and then of course I also get my code, which is quite easy to work with. Has all the settings you would expect for PDW destination. All right, let's jump back over to the next major feature area, which is SSIS enhancements. SSIS enhancements are largely around stability and improved support for what's already there. So we had a number of internal and consulting-based projects that were using SSIS very heavily over the past year, and we work closely with those folks to have them tell us essentially what's everything that we need to do to make this as great of an experience as it is in SSIS. And they gave us a fairly long list of things that were categorized from gotta have to nice to have, and we basically did all of them. Some of the notable changes we've added in cube projects, just like we added in package projects to give you fine-grained control over the DW projects that get emitted. We've also added in analysis services connection information options you can put under every single connection, and this provides support for things like impersonation info and all the other things that you might need to have while building out your cube. The biggest change, and this is the biggest breaking change, is where we've put analysis metadata. And this deserves just a quick examination. So if I go here into my table, let's say table 4, you'll notice that I actually don't have dimensions and facts in the same place anymore. I have dimensions, but they work differently. They're not a root level object anymore. Now, if I have a table, I can actually add a dimension directly to the table. So now I have dim table 4, which is the analysis services dimension metadata associated with this table, and you'll see that's how we actually get tables. I can also, and this is one of the neat things that falls out of this new model, I can add a measure group to the same table, and now table 4 can both be a dimension and a fact table at the same time, or a dimension and a measure group rather at the same time. Or I could make it serve 3 different dimensions. And this approach is going to be a lot more useful for us as we move forward and support more analytics layers, not only tabular, but also some things in Power BI and potentially some other things as well. Essentially, we have this analysis metadata object now, and we can put whatever we need in there. Now, if I go into measure group, what's in here is all the stuff that used to be under the fact object, and I can put all the measures in there. And under dimension, what's in there is what used to be under the dimension object. So there are my attributes, my attribute hierarchies, all of that. So for people who already have existing SSIS investments, this actually isn't as bad as it might look. Essentially, for dimensions, you change the tag name to table, and then you take all the dimension-specific stuff and you push it in underneath an analysis metadata object called dimension, and that's how that all gets tracked. And that's the biggest difference in cubes, and it's the biggest breaking change by far. But we felt we needed to take it in order to have much better support for a more flexible model for allowing all types of analysis metadata going forward. Let's jump back over to the slides, code editing. Code editing has a variety of new features that are range from the important to the annoying, but boy are we glad they're fixed. So the IntelliPrompt enhancements, and I think it probably makes sense actually just to show you these in practice. So I'm going to go into our library here, and I'm going to add in a new Biml file. And you're going to notice a couple of things that are different. So the first thing is when I go into a code nugget and say something like root node dot, you see all this IntelliSense that's popping up here. It looks different. There's this extra stuff down here at the bottom. We now allow you to filter. So I can say I want to filter out everything but properties, and now I get just my properties, and that persists across sessions. So I'm seeing just my properties. Or I want to see just extension methods. But probably the most useful thing, while that's useful, the most useful thing is you'll notice this list is quite a bit shorter than it used to be, even though we've added stuff to root node in this release. And the reason is this toggle right here, toggle framework items not intended for end users. We really keep things open with the Biml object model in MIST, so that anything that we can do inside of MIST, you can do too. So we have things like being able to add event listeners and being able to keeping track of layout syncs and stuff like that. That's all exposed, but 100% of the time you're not going to use it if you're doing standard Biml programming, and even if you're doing like an OEM sort of situation, you're only going to use it a subset of the time. So that's what this toggle does. If we turn it off, you'll notice that the number of items reduces by at least half. And this makes it a lot easier to navigate just the things that you're likely to use. We've also added in a variety of new features around IntelliSense auto-completion. So if I were to say include and then say file, check this out. I now get autocomplete. And the autocomplete can be relative just to the current file, or if I want to make it relative to the other directories that are supported, I can go ahead and add those in just by toggling those switches. But normally you're going to do it relative to the current file. So I can say build settings. And here's the other great thing. This is now a hyperlink. I can hold Control and click on that, and now I get my build settings open, which we'll take another look at in just a moment. We also do our auto-completion of namespaces. So if I say import namespace, we get namespace auto-completion, which is a nice feature, just another big time saver. And we have one other thing that I do want to call out here, which is really quite important. So I know a lot of you make extensive use of include files and call Biml script files in order to do code separation. So I'm going to go ahead and do an include file. I'm going to pretend this is an include file, rather. One of the things I can do now is actually make sure my IntelliSense doesn't break. Because when you're working on that include file, you're normally working on a code fragment, right? But now I can actually say designer Biml file, designer Biml path, rather, and it will no longer assume that I'm working from the Biml root node. I can just say, let me tell you where I want you to pretend I'm starting. Biml / packages / package / tasks / data flow. Right? And now when I do an open bracket, I get all the autocomplete for a data flow. So now you get your full IntelliSense experience is restored even when you're doing include files. One last quick note here, and this is something that you guys can kind of look at on your own. If I were to take, let's say, package and do a Control F, find and place window just works a lot better now. Anything you're focused on and do a Control F or a Control Shift F, it pre-populates, highlights. We track history now. It works a little better in terms of tracking, especially if you have multiple windows that you're switching back and forth between. Find and replace you're going to find is a lot easier to work with than it has been in the past. And one more thing I'll note is that there were a couple of issues around sometimes the code editor would automatically jump if you did IntelliSense to wherever the caret was. That issue's fixed. And also if I do an Alt-Tab away to something else and then Alt-Tab back, you'll notice I can keep typing. I just Alt-Tabbed away to PowerPoint and now I'm back. Right? So a lot of those little things that are annoying are now completely fixed. A couple more neat things that we've added in Biml script. So part of the reason why this release was a long time coming is because we actually rewrote the parser from the ground up. There were a bunch of reasons for this. The old parser was actually one of the first pieces of code that was written in the Biml compiler. and we had run into a situation where we had kind of hit a ceiling. There wasn't much more we were going to be able to do in terms of getting additional performance. There wasn't more we were going to be able to do in terms of adding more features without the code getting very difficult to maintain. So we did a full rewrite of the parser. It's now an awesome framework. It has a bunch more features. It's much faster, and we've got a lot of headroom for further improvements going forward. We've also added in the ability to do nested include directives. I'm sure many of you have noticed that if I include a file and that file includes a file, it didn't work. Now it works. And then the last major Biml script enhancement is the code directive. And this is actually really quite powerful. So if I open up this .NET code file, you'll see, and that's where I was typing when I did, I think, the Alt tab. When I open up this code file, here I have this public class, Scott class 1, and let's say I want to create a new extension method. And this is something you can't do in a Biml script code nugget because extension methods have to live in their own static class. So I can call this get demo label, and this is just about the simplest extension method you can write. AST node, and then in here what I'm going to do is, and actually this is a very old file. Let me create a new one from scratch just so you can see what it looks like, because the new ones actually have additionally have all of these namespaces pre-included for me just for convenience purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and take that, and I'm going to get rid of the one called Scott. There we go. And here we are in class 1. And now I'm going to go ahead and put in my static method, public static string, and what I'm going to do is just say return demo for mist underscore, and then just AST node dot item label. So what I can do is I can take all of my utility methods, I can take all of my my extension methods, everything that I would be having kind of cluttering up my Biml files, I can put those all in one nice code file. I can have placeholder objects that I use for storing temporary data. And I don't know if any of you have run into this situation. If you try and define those in include files, they'll actually be different types with the same definition, and you can get type clashes. Now with this CS file, the ability to just include a code file, all of that goes away. So if I go back in here, all I have to do is reference this as a code file. And by the way, this works in BIDS Helper too. And then I can go ahead and reference my code file that I just created. And now here's the best part. I go ahead and say root node dot, let's say tables dot first, and then when I say get, we have a get demo label that we just defined a second ago. There it is, and then I go ahead and just allow it to print it out because it's an extension method. It's operating on the table, right? So I just defined something that looks like it was part of Biml, and there it is, demo for Mist Table 2. Just that simple. One more thing I do want to point out, this is a smaller thing, but I'm sure a lot of people, especially those who do community presentations, for which we're very grateful, are going to be very happy about. On packages, you may have noticed here that, and this was from an import, so we have some additional stuff we don't need anymore. Let me just get rid of those so this is a little more clear. Look at that. There's no constraint mode anymore. Constraint mode is now optional, and it defaults to parallel. If you want to have a linear constraint mode, go ahead and set it to linear, and you're good to go. But otherwise, it's going to default to parallel, so when you're demoing this to the first person, you don't have something complicated to explain right on the first go. So hopefully that makes some of our community partners very happy. Let's jump back over to the slides quickly. Biml API features, these we're going to mostly talk to just so we can get to some of the metadata stuff and have enough time for it. That new parser rewrite that I mentioned, we've exposed those methods out as well. So there are now parse and parse into methods that are available on all classes. So you know how you can do a get Biml on any object in Biml and what it'll do, and so I'm starting from the API and getting the Biml back out. Well, this does the opposite. You can take any fragment of Biml code and call parse, and it turns it into an API object for you. So now you can write little Biml fragments and even store them in files. You can call a parse on the contents of the file, and then you can go ahead and make some changes programmatically if you want to, and then say get Biml and get it right back out and round trip that as many times as you like. We also have a new get property value method that's the same thing as, let's say I call table.name. I can now say table.getPropertyValue and then pass it in a string name. That's useful primarily if you have a code generation model that makes it where you don't necessarily know which properties you want to access ahead of time. It makes it a little more, a little easier to make your code even more dynamic than it was before. We've added in an AST root node build settings and object tag. And this I'm going to jump back to show you very briefly. These are very useful things. When you need them, there's very little replacement. So there's been some confusion around how do I get my build settings? And there are a couple of different ways to do it, and we decided just to make it super simple. So when you call root node.build settings, we've made a couple of convenience properties in there so you can very easily get, let me show you just the properties. You can very easily get the SQL Server version it's compiling against, the SSIS version, whether or not project deployment model is being used, etc. But you can also go through and just get access to the options directory. So even if command line options were passed in, you can get to every single thing from right here. And that makes it very easy for you to go ahead and customize your scripts based on input that are being passed in through the command line or just through system configuration. And that's all there and all very easy to use now. Object tag is a similar feature. You know how we have annotations that you can put on any Biml object? Now you can put object tags. An object tag is basically a dictionary where you can store key value pairs of .NET objects associated with any other object. So if you do a bunch of work up front where maybe you create this big sort of metadata cache, you could just go ahead and put that in the object tag of your root node and then be able to use that all the way down the line in as many different locations as you'd like. We've added a whole bunch of additional convenience collections, for example, to root node. So now, in addition to just connections, you can look at your DB connections or just your ODBC connections or just your OLEDB connections. And when you do them, they're already pre-typed, so you don't have to do any typecasts. We've added a bunch of those. We've also added in a get database schema method, which we won't have time to show here. It works, excuse me, almost exactly like import DB, except depending on your particular server configuration, it can be anywhere from about the same speed to about 500 times faster if you've got a particularly slow database or a particularly large database that you only want a couple of tables out of. It allows you to pass in just a list of schema names and just a list of table names, and it does all that filtering server side instead of client side, so you get the best performance. We also have better support and we'll just talk to these, better support for making changes. Some of you may have had experience in the past where you'll have some Biml objects that you bring in, maybe like a table import, and then you'll make some programmatic changes, and then you'll call get Biml, and it doesn't look like all the changes were reflected. We fixed every one of those issues that we were able to find. The support for that is excellent at this point. And then we've also refactored all the Biml extensions, our database providers, our metadata providers, all of our extension methods into one DLL called Biml extensions, which you'll see in your install path. And that is something that by the end of this calendar year we will have open sourced and allow people to make contributions if they'd like to support additional database providers, to support additional extension methods, or even just to see how we went about building our own. Offline schemas. So now we're getting into the last two major feature areas, and I think we'll have just enough time to cover them quickly. The first one here is around offline schemas. So this is a problem that is pervasive in SSIS, where you have, and let me just go ahead and clean up some of these things that we were working with before so we just get our error list down to a minimum. One other quick thing, if I right-click on anything that is a live script, I can hit Convert to Reference Biml, and it'll put it in my library and take it off of the live queue, just another little convenience feature. So this is something that we all have to deal with if we're doing data flows in SSIS. A DTSX file is by definition not valid if it does not have all the external metadata for any one of the components that's talking to some source system or some remote database, right? Whether it's an OLEDB source or a lookup or an ODBC destination, all those things, they have to have all their external metadata in the file. Even if you say validate external metadata equals false, even if you say delay validation equals true, it's still got to be there. And that's the reason why when you do a build, it may not validate, it may not check it against the source until the last minute, but it's still got to be there whether you like it or not. So that's why when we do a build, we always have to go and talk to the database to get that information so that we can embed it into the DTSX file. And that obviously has limitations. It certainly has limitations for some of the online scenarios that we want to enable down the road, and it has limitations even just for organizations today where that can slow down your build substantially, where you might be trying to build something dynamically against tables that don't exist yet. And so how do you solve that problem? The way we do it is through offline schemas. So offline schemas are these new objects. They're kind of like collections of tables, but not quite, because schema information has to have a bit more in it than just a table column, because different providers will interpret things differently. So you have to have some additional information sometimes about provider types and things like that, depending on which connection you're going against. So what an offline schema lets me do, let's create a new one from scratch. So I'm going to create offline schema 1, and I can go ahead and add a new schema item, and then I can say this is going to pertain to a query or a table that I might have modeled or an external table that's on a system someplace, and I can go ahead and write a query in here. So select, let me just say 1 as foo, and then I can say put that against the source, and that'll actually give me a result out, 1 as foo. And what I'd like to do is say, here's what, when I run this query, here's what I would have gotten out. So let's simulate the query for the purposes of getting that build information. So essentially, I would have gotten foo out, and it would have been type in 32, and this is basically all I need to have. And once I've done this, I could actually do an offline build against this. Now, of course, this is very artificial, right? You're not, generally speaking, going to be doing something this simple, and you certainly don't want to, by hand, put in 50, 100, even more columns in a result set that I might be getting back. So that's why we have some of these accelerator buttons across the top. So if I go ahead and delete that offline schema item that I just added, you'll notice that I have these 3 packages that are very similar. They've got basically just source the target copying, and they'll go from a query into a destination table. So what I'm going to do is go back into my offline schema, and I can say, my SSIS data flow components, all those things that are going to be doing the external metadata references, go ahead and look at all of them and give me all the schema items for those. So I click Load New Items, and there we go. There they are. For each of my packages, there they are. Those are the queries that I happen to put in there. They're largely nonsense queries, but it's 1 is foo and then star from DBO addresses. And then I've got my target tables, which are addresses 1, addresses 2, and addresses 3. And this is all great, but you'll notice my column information isn't filled in yet. I don't actually know what these are going to return. So what I can do is actually say sync all items against now the data source. And when I do that, it's going to say, you sure you want to do that? Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do it. And it's now going and doing what we would do when we do a build in order to bring down all of that information. And there we go. And it says some items fail to reload, specifically addresses 3, because addresses 3 doesn't exist. That error is there on purpose. So you could go and fix that. So addresses 3 is still empty. I don't think I clicked it. There we go. But all the other ones have full schema information and everything you need. And we also, and this is quite neat, keep track of which reference component these things came from. So if we go to this reference component and make a change, let's say I go into package 1 and I change my query to, instead of being 1 is foo, I do 1 is like foo 2. Or actually, let me change it in a more subtle way. Let me just put in some more numbers. It would help if those are numbers. And now I save this off. Let me go ahead and close the project and reopen it, and you're going to see what happens. By the way, we're going to see another feature here once we reopen, which is that we remember your state from the previous session, and we bring it right back up. So we're opening 12 items, which does take a second, since some of them have designers. But what you'll see in the upper right-hand corner is this flag that says, oh, look at that. You got some notifications. Your reference component has changed since last sync. You changed that query. And also, it's got them on 2 of them. Because I have it in, because I was referencing it from both Schema 1 and the offline schema backup that I previously had. So if I go here into offline schema and just hit sync existing items, it goes away, and it fixed it. You notice now it's got that really long thing in there. So this is something that's fully configurable. We also sync against the data source. So if you made a change against the data source, or if you were to change this so it didn't match the data source, it'll tell you. It runs by default, I think, every 30 minutes, and also on project load. And that's something that you can turn off in your project settings, or you can change the frequency of right here. So it's every 60 minutes, every hour. And you can enable or disable those periodic checks. So what's the benefit of all this? A couple of things. One, if I want to have blazing fast builds on a relatively stable schema, All I have to do is click on Use Schema for Offline Build, and what our build system does is it says, okay, if I've got a query that I need to run, first thing I'm going to do is look for all my offline schemas that are marked as being used for offline build or that have an item that's overridden to be used for offline build, and if I can find that in there, I'm going to use that instead. I'm going to use what's in here instead of querying the database. So you can do it so that you never talk to a database again if you've got an offline schema. Build performance can be excellent, especially if the database is your bottleneck. Option number 2, if you're a consultant and you're going on site for the first time and you can't get access to a data source and you've got a 6-week engagement and it looks like it's going to take 2 to 3 weeks to get approval for that data source, no problem. Have somebody who has access go ahead and run this, get an offline schema for you, give it to you, and you can start doing development against it, including building packages that they can run. Option number 3, let's say that you have a source system that you know is about to change. You can create an offline schema, simulate the change to that source system, do a build, and see if anything breaks. So you can be more proactive about those changes that are happening and that are potentially coming downstream. And there are other benefits and things that you can do with this. Like, for example, the dynamic build situation. Right? You can go ahead and create these things and then do a build against them, even though the tables don't exist on the server yet, because they're going to be part of your build process. So it gives you another option for doing that incremental build out of a larger data warehouse. All of the buttons up here, the methods that we call to do that are all exposed through the API. You can call them yourself too if you wanted to call and verify that things as part of one of your Biml scripts were lining up with either your packages or with your data source columns. So that's a great set of functionality. Last thing we really want to look at is metadata demos. The metadata modeling functionality. So metadata modeling is something that has been a pain, I think, for a lot of people. They will exhaust the natural metadata that they have at their disposal, whether that is in database schemas or in data dictionaries or whatever it happens to be, and now they'll have to start creating some synthetic metadata to go along with that. And the problem is it feels like you're starting from scratch. What should my schema look like? Once I've got my schema, what's the best way to store it? How should I do data entry into it? How do I pull data out of it in a way that's not very fragile? And that's a set of problems that everybody has to go back and solve individually over and over again. But what we've done is we've now added an abstraction. So essentially we've got this metadata model that you can create. And the metadata model, you just right-click and say Add Metadata Model. And this allows you to create essentially like an entity relationship diagram for the schema for your metadata. So here you'll see that I have a metadata model that I've already created that you might want to use to control an automated staging load. I've got some connections, and those connections have some properties like a connection name and a connection string. I've got some tables which have a table name, a default SCD type, whether or not we should include all columns by default or include no columns by default. And of course, a table has a relationship to a connection. And then I've got columns. The columns are related to a table, many to one. And I have a column name and overriding SCD type to override what the default was for the table. And then I can also say is excluded if I had like a full inclusion and I wanted to get rid of some. So that's all pretty straightforward. What the best part is, no, maybe not the best part, a really nice part, is that we auto-generate for you, based on that model, a metadata instance. So let me put these side by side. You can see what happened here. So we have columns. If I select columns, here's a column I've defined. And you'll notice it has properties that are exactly the same as what's defined for columns. It has a column name and SCD type, and it is excluded. And if I were to go in, for example, and take one of those properties, let's say SCD type, and change the name of it. So keep an eye right over here where it says SCD type. We actually change the instance editor that we create for you on the fly in response to changes to the model. So this editor is something you can put in front of a less technical person. They can fill out metadata for you. It'll get stored in Biml, or we have an extensible provider model, whichever provider you use or whichever provider you implement. Long term, we're going to have providers for databases, SharePoint lists, Excel files, everywhere you can imagine putting in storing your metadata. And since we're basing it off of an ER diagram, we can store it basically anywhere. You know, it might be a little cumbersome in some cases, but basically any persistence format you can use to store an ER diagram. So this is a pretty powerful set of functionality. Once we've created our metadata instance information for our model, we can then consume it very, very easily from our scripts. So if I go here into, let's say, our table and view the Biml for this, the only thing we have to do to get this information out is the following. We say metadata model wrapper And this is configurable, right? So for every metadata model, we create a dynamic object for you that mirrors what's in that object. So you can override which namespace you want it to live in and what you want the name to be, so you don't have to have our brand in your namespace, and you can change it to something other than metadata model wrapper. But you go ahead and load up a metadata instance, or you give it a provider pointing at wherever that metadata happens to be stored using our provider model, and it will automatically create for you this dynamic object. And then instead of having to go and query deep into the Biml, you can just say metadata dot. Remember how we had columns and connections and tables? There they are. If I were to add another entity type, it would just automatically show up. And if I say tables dot first, there's all the stuff for tables. There's the name, the table connection, the table name, the default SCD type. It's all there, and it's all super easy to get to. So this way, I'm now able to consume all my metadata, and you see I've got my tables in here. So let me just connect the dots here on one last step and open up my metadata instance that we were looking at earlier. And now all self-contained within this metadata framework, which is extraordinarily extensible. We took great pains to make sure that it would be able to work regardless of where you were storing your metadata. I can go ahead and add in a new metadata item. And let's go ahead and make this one for, let's say, contact type. And actually this would go faster because I've got a bunch of downstream stuff that is compiling in the background. If I went ahead and actually suspended live Biml script processing, but we can just do this quickly without it. And I'm going to go ahead and add in a table name of, let's get back in there. Let's add in a table name of content type, a contact type rather, and Adventure works. And just that fast, as soon as this finishes recompiling, we're going to see contact type, and there we go. There's my contact type tables for staging and process. There's my load packages, and you guys know that you can configure these Biml scripts to do whatever you want them to do. But it's all there, it's all baked in. We've connected the dots on metadata. This is someplace we're going to be making a lot more investments going down the road. But for now, we've got, I think, an awesome foundation for building your own metadata-driven solutions without having to start from square one, and it's something that we're going to be enhancing and improving over time. So just back to the deck. We've seen metadata modeling, and that's a very quick overview. There's a separate video that just focuses on metadata modeling online that Peter Avenant from our Sydney, Australia office put together. It's a great resource to take a look at for more information. And just a note on breaking changes, I think we've talked about most of these. Package projects has become projects just to support the fact that we have cube projects now too. Query source and destination, which hopefully nobody was using, they were abstract components that really didn't do what most people expected them to, have been removed. If you're using them, just switch to using an OLADB or ADO.NET variant. SSIS, we already talked about those breaking changes. And there's one that you guys should know about, Hadron, and this is a bit funny perhaps. We've retired that for a bunch of reasons, some of them technical, some of them because of brand confusion. One big one is because if you transpose two of those letters, it's a pretty rude word. So Hadron is now gone from everywhere. So hadron.exe is now bimlc.exe. If you're really depending on hadron.exe in your build process, you can rename bimlc.exe to hadron.exe and keep working for the time being. It won't care. But all of our namespaces have also been changed. Wherever you saw Hadron, just replace it with Biml and you'll be good. But we have put in a little fix so that if that's used in an import someplace, we catch it and we'll auto-patch it for you and give you a warning. So that shouldn't be too painful in the short term, but please, the next time you do a refactoring of your code, replace all those Hadrons with Bimls and you'll be good to go going forward. And that's everything that we have. I think I did go just a couple of minutes over, so thank you everyone for your patience.